Welcome to the Atlanta Community Tool Bank Tool Training Center. Today, I'm going to show you how to do 3 different basic patches in sheetrock. The first one would be for a hole no bigger than about an inch, kind of like the size of a hammerhead. This process will simply be filling and taping. The second will be for holes about the size of a doorknob, or even a little bigger. This is called a hot patch, but don't worry, no heat is involved. The third will be for all larger areas, where you will simply attach new sheetrock to the existing studs and then tape. Please note that these methods are for drywall patching using the same thickness of sheetrock as what you have in your existing wall. And for residential, that is 1/2 inch 95% of the time. Now let's take a look at some of the tools that will be needed. I'm just going to go from left to right on top of this tool bench to show you the tools. First, we have a square for marking our sheetrock. We have fasteners, we have screws, and we'll use the screw gun for that. We have some cupped sheetrock nails, and we'll need a hammer for that. We have a pencil, we have the sheetrock of the appropriate size, some scraps of wood to help secure the sheetrock, the tape for using with the spackling. Safety glasses are always a good idea. We have various size spackling knives for the different steps in the process of patching. It's helpful to have the sheetrock mud pan, but you don't have to have it. If you're just doing one patch, you don't need to go to the expense of purchasing the mud pan. I can show you a few easy ways to use these tools instead. We have the sander that's used for sheetrock. This is an official one. You don't have to have this official one. If you're doing a whole lot of sheetrock or maybe a whole room, it's good to go ahead and buy one. But just for what we're doing today in these patches, you could take a block of wood and simply wrap a piece of sandpaper around it. You'll need a utility knife to cut the sheetrock, tape measure, the all-purpose joint compound. You don't need to buy anything expensive. Don't buy a 5-gallon bucket if you're just doing small patches. Get the size appropriate. If you're just doing the small or medium patch, this size is really big enough. The first and smallest patch that we will look at will be for a hole that is no more than 1 inch in diameter. That is small enough for a piece of paper tape to cover it. Even though this is called tape, it does not have adhesive on it. The adhesive is a thin coat of the joint compound that is spread below it. The tape is necessary wherever there is a break or joint in the sheetrock. If you did not use it, in time, a crack would appear at the joint. To start off, I'm going to get some of this spackling compound out of the bucket with my 3-inch blade. I'm going to use my 6-inch blade to kind of hold that spackling compound like this. Now I'm going to take some of it. I'm going to smear it into that hole. I want to get it in there really good. I want enough to really go into that hole. So I'm going to smear it in a couple directions. There we go. So that's kind of what it will look like when you're done smearing that in the hole. Now, we're going to let this dry at least overnight. We want it to be completely dry before we come back and put the tape on. So when it is completely dry, this is kind of what it's going to look like. And I can feel on this, there's a little bit of a bulge on that. That's why I wanted it to dry overnight and not just take the tape and just go right over top of it. Had I done that, the paper tape would have a bulge in it too, and then we wouldn't be able to sand it successfully. So instead what we're going to do is we're going to let it dry overnight, and then we're going to come back with our sander. We're going to very gently sand over this. You just want it to be flush on all the surfaces. You don't want to over sand it. What you want to avoid is sanding to the point that you peel up or you break the surface of this paper. Now that we have this sanded, I'm going to do a quick dust off on it so we can put some of the joint compound over the sanded patch so that we can apply the tape. I'm going to show you how to do that. First, I want to just dust it off, get some of the excess dust off of there. I'm applying this in a thin layer, but thick enough so that when I put that tape on there, there's joint compound over every portion of this piece of tape. So apply our tape, kind of push it down. I'm going to put my finger on the top of this and start up here. I'm going to try to push out some of that mud that's up underneath. Mud is another name for spackling compound. It's white mud. Okay, now I'm smushing it out in this direction. I feel like I've got this very well bedded. That's kind of like the sticky part of the tape I was talking about earlier. Now that I got that done, I'm going to go back to doing what is called bedding. And that's where I put like the first coat of joint compound over this tape and just kind of smooth it out a little bit. I'm not going to overwork it. There, that looks pretty good. It's not perfect. I can see a few lines and ridges, but we're going to sand it later, so it's okay. And when we sand it, just like we were careful the first time not to break this paper, we don't want to break the paper on the paper tape either. So we're going to say that that's done. Now, you want that to dry overnight. After it dries overnight, it's going to look something like this. We're ready to do a light sand. Again, we're going to be careful not to sand so heavy that we tear up any paper. Kind of get these edges. You want these edges to be kind of smooth. You want them to blend into the sheetrock without tearing up the paper. I think I've about got it. I can see here where I've just about hit the paper, so that's a warning sign to me to stop sanding. So we're ready to put what could be the final coat of sheetrock mud on this. Sometimes you can get it in one more coat, and sometimes it'll take 2 more coats. We'll just look at it and see. So to put this next coat on, we're going to take the sheetrock mud just like we did before. I'm going to kind of spin it around. I want to cover all this real good. Now, up to now, I have been using this to kind of hold some of the mud, but with this blade being wider than this one would be handy right now to use as this patch gets a little bit bigger in diameter. I'm going to feather out these edges, kind of like that. Kind of watching to see that I've got consistent coverage. This is looking pretty good. I see a little bit of a line here, but I think that line is going to come out in sanding next time around. This may be enough to complete this patch. We'll see tomorrow after this dries and we sand. So this patch here was the second coat. We've allowed it to dry overnight. I'm going to go ahead and do a sand on that. I'm being gentle, circular motion. I see a little bit of paper there, so I'm going to be very cautious not to over sand in that area. But I also see these little ridges right here at the line between the joint compound and the sheetrock. I want to get a little bit more sanding done on that, so it's a nice smooth line. I'm not pressing hard on this. I'm using very gentle pressure. That looks good. And I can feel it too. I can feel that that's smooth. I don't feel any ridges on there. It feels smooth all the way across. Another trick that I've seen people do in the past is to take a light of some sort and kind of shine it and see if you can see any shadows or anything. Sometimes the light will help imperfections show up. The second patch we will do, I call a hot patch. I've heard it called many other names like butterfly patch, California patch, or even Dutchman's patch. For this and the next patch, you will need a sheetrock saw kind of like this one. The procedure for this patch is to make your hole into a nice, easy to cut square. Then, to cut your piece of patching sheetrock larger so that you have paper flaps to cover your joints. That may sound a little confusing, so let me show you how it's done. We'll start out by marking a nice square around this hole. We're going to cut this out. we're going to use our sheetrock saw. The procedure that I like to use for this is to cut into the corners and to then use the utility knife to score and snap. Cut into all the corners. Now I'm going to take my utility blade, just going from corner to corner. There we go. Now we got a nice square. It'll be easy to cut our sheetrock with this nice square as opposed to an odd shape. I've already got this piece of sheetrock cut. You can see that it's cut 2 or 3 inches larger than the square. So now this is the tricky part. You want to cut off sheetrock off of this to make a square that's the same size as this one. But you want to leave a little bit of this paper. That paper is going to be the equivalent of your paper tape. So here's the way to do that. We'll start by measuring the square. Just under 3 inches by 3 inches. And this is 6 inches. That means we can have about 1.5 inches around each one of the sides. So I'm going to measure 1.5 inches off of the bottom. I'm going to draw a line. I'm going to score. When I do the score, I'm going to do it on the back of the sheetrock. This being the front of the sheetrock. You see the color's the same. Okay? I've scored it. Now, if we were just cutting sheetrock, you would snap it, and you would cut this line in that corner there. But that's not what we're going to do with the hot patch. We're going to take the sheetrock, we're going to kind of bend it back. We're going to peel this piece of sheetrock off of this paper. You can see how that worked. We're going to do that all the way around this piece of sheetrock. Okay, I went and drew the rest of the lines on this. The next cut that I'm going to do, I'll do this one. Now I snap it, and I peel the paper back. I did both of the scores. Peel that back. Snap, peel. Okay, you see how we've got this piece of sheetrock, and it's got these flaps that I was talking about earlier. And this is going to fit in here. We might have to do a little bit of adjusting. And that's not uncommon. So it looks like this needs to be opened up just a little bit. I'm just going to take the sheetrock saw. And that worked. That fits right in there. Okay, and you can see how we got these nice flaps that creates the tape. This is going to be a good solid patch. Okay, the next thing that I like to do is I like to put some wood backing inside of this hole. It helps this to not vibrate, helps this to not at some point do any cracking. I've seen people do these patches and not put any wood backing on this. So it can be done, but I always feel a little nervous that it could crack out in the future. So I'm going to show you how to put a piece of wood in there as a backer. All you'll need is a few screws and any kind of a scrap of wood. I'm using a piece of plywood. It's about 1/2 inch thick. So you should be able to take this piece of plywood, push it through the hole, and then hold it in place with one hand. With the other hand, you're going to take your I'm using 1 5/8 drywall screws. That's a good size. You can probably get away with 1 1/4 also. Hold this board really tight. I'm feeling the board push away as I'm trying to screw this in, but I'm going to keep holding it, and now the board is starting to suck in. That's what we want. Okay, it's tight now. I didn't over install this screw. I've got it so it's just barely below the surface, but not really breaking the paper. There we go, nice and solid. Now we can take our little scrap of sheetrock and push it on there. That's perfectly flush. We use the same thickness sheetrock, of course, as we have on the wall. If you used a different thickness of sheetrock, it wouldn't be nice and flush. So be aware of that. And remember, 99% of the time, you're going to have 1/2 inch sheetrock. It's pretty standard. With the spackling compound, we want to treat it similar to like we did on the first patch. We want to spread some compound around each side. We'll get some inside the hole, and that's okay. In fact, that's good. It helps everything to stick together, and it's kind of like glue. I've got what looks like pretty solid coverage all the way around. So now, let's take our piece of sheetrock, plop it in that hole. Now that looks good. And we know that we've got that board in the center, so let's just take one sheetrock screw and put it right through the middle. I know that's spinning, looks a little crazy, but I'm going to let it do that until it gets close, and then I'll stop it. There it is. It's starting to suck in. Now I'm going to hold it a little bit. And I want it, it's not quite flush with the sheetrock yet. It's got to set in a little bit more. So, there we go. That's perfect. I can rub my fingers over it, and I can feel that it's embedded just a little bit below the surface. Now we're going to kind of push some of that joint compound out from underneath the paper. There we go. That's looking pretty good. Now we're going to kind of bed this. We're going to take some more sheetrock compound and go over the top, go all the way around. There we go. We're not going to leave it like that. We're going to, now that we've got joint compound over the whole thing, I'm going to smooth it out a little bit. I was putting a little extra pressure on the top here to taper down a little bit. You can do the same thing on the bottom with a little more pressure in this direction. There we go. That looks pretty good. I think I'm going to finish there. We're going to have to let this dry overnight. We'll let it dry overnight. We're going to come back and do a very small amount of sanding. There's a little bit of a buildup right there at the ridge where we had these two, where we were putting pressure this way and this way. That small ridge was created, and that's okay. We're going to do a very light sand to get that ridge out of there. Okay, so the sheetrock is dried, and we're ready to do a light sand on this. Use my blade to scrape off any big chunks. Yeah. I want to make sure that I don't tear any of the paper while I'm doing the sanding. I can see I'm a little close in that spot there and that spot there. So I'm going to stop sanding on this. I'm going to go up and sand a little bit right here. Okay, same thing there. I can see a little bit of the paper starting to come up. So we're going to stop sanding. Although there's a little ridge right there. I'm just going to sand a little bit on this. A little bit on this side too. That's it. That wasn't much sanding, but that was enough. That's all you need to do. Don't over sand. Okay, now that we've got this done, we're ready to do another coat of the sheetrock mud. I'm going to do a real good covering over the whole thing. That looks pretty good. The last time we did this, we spread the spackling compound in this direction. This time, I'm going to spread the spackling compound in this direction. And I'm doing the same technique where I did a little excess pressure on this side to kind of help feather it in. There we go. I'm going to clean my blade. And we see we got a lot of sheetrock mud left in the middle. I'm just going to very gently go down the middle. And I'm going to stop. I'm not going to touch it anymore. I'm going to let that sit. I'm going to let that dry overnight, and we're going to come back and look and see how it looks tomorrow. Okay, we let this dry overnight, and now we've got a pretty smooth surface here. I can feel, with my hand, I can feel some ridges and stuff. So we're going to go ahead and sand it. And again, we're going to be real cautious not to sand down and peel up any of the paper. I can see a little bit of paper poking through right there. So I want to feel on this. It feels pretty smooth. I don't feel any ridges. So well, wait, there might be a little ridge right there. I see a little line right there. Do a little bit more sanding, just up in here. I'm going to avoid that spot right there. Okay, now I see a little bit of paper starting to show through there, so I'm going to be cautious again. I'm going to feel. This feels really good. It feels nice and smooth. I don't feel any ridges. I don't feel any bumps. And mind you, this is a small piece for demonstration purposes, and if it was a larger wall, you would probably get to where the tapering place is onto the bare sheetrock. So check those places. You want to do some light sanding on those, not too much. I mean, just like this, you don't want to sand down and you don't want to disturb that paper. So if you find there's a ridge that you can't get out with sanding without hurting the paper, go ahead and do another little skim coat of sheetrock mud over that area. I think that does it for this patch. I hope this was helpful to you, and I hope you can see that it's really not that hard to do. It just takes a little time and patience. The third and final patch that I will show you is for anything approximately a foot or larger. The process for this patch is to cut a square hole around what needs to be patched, making sure that at least 2 studs are available for fastening the new sheetrock. Then taping and finishing the joints. We will use the same tools that we used for the last patch. Okay, this is the hole that we're going to patch. We're going to start out by making a nice square hole around this patch, something that we can easily cut out of a piece of sheetrock and easily patch in. So we know that there's a stud right there. We know there's a stud over here. I'm going to go ahead and draw a straight line here and here so that we can get the cuts going and get this patched. This is not long enough. Find whatever kind of straight edge you have laying around to make these straight lines. Just like on the last patch, we needed a sheetrock saw to open the hole up a little bit and to get it to the proper size for patching. We're going to do the same thing here. It's very easy, can't you tell? Now that we have the horizontal cuts done, we can use a utility knife to help score a little bit, and we can cut in sideways with the sheetrock saw to get down to that stud. Okay, so while we were cutting with the sheetrock saw, we reached a point where we hit the stud. So we know the stud is right there. I'm going to go ahead and put a little mark right where that stud is. So the stud is right there. I'm going to use this flat side and go against that. We got the other side of the stud here. So now we got 2 points, and we know the stud is 1.5 inches thick. So 3/4 in should be the middle of that stud. So 3/4 of the way in is about right there. You can use a tape measure if you're not sure. That's where we're going to make the next cut. For this next cut, I'm going to use a combination of a sheetrock saw and a utility knife to make the final cut. I'm going to start out by just scoring this line with the utility knife. I've seen some people just take the utility knife and just keep scoring down and do that all the way down to the stud. I usually have a hard time doing that, so I'm going to also use this and then come back and use this. The nice rough edge on this sheetrock saw really digs in. Now I'm going to go back and finish it with this utility knife. Here we go. I just pulled back on it a little bit and it snapped in place. Now we need to get this piece off. It's already almost falling off. There just happens to be no fasteners right here, so this is going to pull right out of here. I'm going to clean up some of the rough edges. Get this corner cleaned up real good. We want to make sure our new piece of sheetrock sits in nice and flush. Now we need to cut our piece of sheetrock. This piece of sheetrock is already 16 inches wide. So all we need to do is to cut this width, and that is 8 inches. I'm marking it in 2 places. I can use this straight edge to score the line too if I want. I'm just going to freehand this cut with the utility knife. cut. You don't usually need to. Okay, now we want to snap it back. Bend it. On this crease here, I'm going to cut it. And while I'm cutting it, I'm going to be careful not to direct this utility knife towards any body parts. Now let's do a dry fit before we secure it in. That's perfect, it fits right in there. Okay, we're going to go ahead and screw it in. If this was a larger hole and there was maybe a stud in the middle, we would want to take and mark the studs before we put this piece of sheetrock in. That way, if, say for instance, if there was a stud right here, I put my 2 marks in. Once I put my piece of sheetrock in, I wouldn't be able to see that stud, but I can see those 2 lines. But we don't need those today. So we're going to secure this with 4 sheetrock screws. These are 1 5/8" screws. With 1/2" sheetrock, you can also use 1 1/4" screws. When the screws go in, you want them to just set. You want them to just set below the surface of the paper, preferably without breaking the paper. Now that the sheetrock is secure, we're ready to mud and tape it. We're going to start with our horizontal lines. We've got the sheetrock mud looking like a nice, smooth, consistent line. I don't see any dips or any valleys in this. So that's a good bed for your sheetrock tape to sit in. Center the tape over the crack. Take your blade, push it next to the sheetrock, and pull your tape up. Squeeze out some of the sheetrock mud in both directions. There. Now, let's do that same thing on the bottom here. I got a nice, even-looking line. There's no dips. Let's do this other piece of horizontal tape. I'm going to end it here, rip it off, squeeze out the excess sheetrock mud in both directions. We got the horizontals done. Now we're going to do this vertical. Same thing, put the tape over the line, rip it, squeeze out in both directions. That's looking pretty good. So we've got the tape on. Now we want to embed this tape. You want to do that with some of your sheetrock mud. We'll do the same thing. We'll start on the top. Just kind of put a nice coat over the top of the tape. Try to get it even. Go back and forth a couple times, but try not to overdo it. Same thing in your lower horizontal. We're going to go ahead and put a little bit of mud very carefully in this vertical. This is going to have to dry at least overnight. Might take a couple nights to dry because some of the mud is a little bit thick on this inside corner here. After it dries, we're going to do the same thing we did with that first patch. We're going to do a light sand over everything, being careful not to break any of the tape. Then we're going to go ahead with another coat. As you do the next coats, your sheetrock lines are going to get a little bit wider. It's helpful to start using a wider blade. That helps the joint compound to feather out. Just finish up with a light sand and you'll be ready to paint. Use primer first. I hope that this video has at least given you the confidence to try your own hand at sheetrock patching. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see you on another video soon.